She was standing 3 feet away when the foreman rode in and said the one word that destroyed everything. Boss, just one word. And the woman he loved, the woman he had lied to from the moment she stepped off that train, looked him in the eye and said, "You put me through a test, Mr. Hawthorne. Without my knowledge or consent, you made me prove myself worthy of your love while you proved yourself to be a liar." This is how the richest rancher in Wyoming nearly lost the only thing his money could never buy. The letter said he was a ranch hand, simple, honest, lonely. It said he worked on a large spread in the Wyoming Territory, mending fences and driving cattle for a man named Hawthorne. It is said he loved the sound of a creek at dawn and the way the stars looked without city lights to dim them. It said he was looking for a woman who valued the life of the mind as much as the work of the hands. The letter did not say that three of the tallest, broadest men she had ever seen would be standing on the platform of Copper Ridge Station waiting for her. It did not say they all carried the Hawthorne name, and it most certainly did not say that the man she had traveled 3 days to marry was hiding a secret that could destroy everything before it even began. Before we go any further, if you are new here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I share new frontier stories every single week. And drop me a comment while you are listening. Tell me where you are tuning in from tonight. Now then, let me take you back to where it started. The morning of October the 14th, 1878 began with the smell of oak smoke and boiling coffee in a cabin beside Willow Creek, 7 miles northeast of the small town of Copper Ridge in the Wyoming Territory. The cabin was modest, one bedroom, a kitchen area built around a cast iron stove that had seen better years. A sitting space with 2 wooden chairs, a small table, and a bookshelf that stood conspicuously empty. Out front, a narrow porch overlooked the creek, where water ran clear over stones polished smooth by 1,000 seasons. Behind the cabin, a vegetable garden showed signs of recent and somewhat amateur planting. Half a dozen chickens scratched in the dirt yard, pecking at nothing in particular with the aimless determination that only chickens possess. Inside that cabin, 3 of the wealthiest men in the Wyoming Territory were arguing over which of them looked the most convincingly poor. Caleb Hawthorne, the eldest at 33, stood before a cracked mirror nailed to the bedroom wall, buttoning a faded flannel shirt that did not belong to him. The shirt had been borrowed from Colt Brennan, one of his senior ranch hands, along with a pair of worn trousers and boots, so scuffed that the original color was a matter of speculation. Caleb had spent the past week letting his beard grow rough and wild. He had rubbed dirt under his fingernails that morning for good measure. The transformation was convincing. Where Caleb Hawthorne, the cattle baron, stood tall in tailored wool and polished leather, the man in the mirror looked like exactly what he was pretending to be, a hired hand earning wages on someone else's land. The deception had been his idea. And standing in that cabin on the morning his mail-order bride was set to arrive on the 3:15 train, Caleb still believed it was a good one. His brothers disagreed. Wyatt Hawthorne, the middle brother at 30, leaned against the cabin doorframe with his arms crossed and a lazy grin that did not reach his eyes. Wyatt stood 6 feet 6 inches tall, a full inch above Caleb, which he enjoyed pointing out at every opportunity. His dark blonde hair caught the light from the open door, and his amber eyes, warmer than his brother's, but no less sharp, tracked Caleb's movements with an expression that sat somewhere between amusement and alarm. "This is going to blow up in your face, Cal." Wyatt's voice was easy, almost playful, but the words carried weight. "You cannot lie to a woman you are planning to marry and expect it to end well. That is not how any of this works." Caleb said nothing. He adjusted the collar of the borrowed shirt and checked his reflection one more time. From the small table in the corner, where he sat with the stillness of a man who had learned to conserve every word, Silas Hawthorne spoke. The youngest brother at 27 was also the quietest. He stood 6 feet 4, the smallest of the 3, though on any other man that frame would have been called imposing. His auburn hair caught copper in the morning light, and his golden amber eyes held a quality of patience that could be mistaken for indifference by anyone who did not know him. Mother would not have approved of this. The words landed in the cabin like a stone dropped into still water. Caleb's jaw tightened. He turned from the mirror. For a moment, the only sounds were the creak outside and the clucking of chickens and the low hiss of coffee on the stove. Everyone in that room knew Caleb's reasons. 5 years earlier, a woman named Lucinda Garrett had come to Copper Ridge and turned her considerable charms on the eldest Hawthorne brother. She was beautiful. She was flattering. She seemed to adore him. They courted for 4 months and Caleb proposed, and 2 weeks before the wedding, he overheard Lucinda telling her friend in the general store that she had landed the biggest fish in Wyoming and could not wait to spend his money in San Francisco. The betrayal nearly broke him. He called off the wedding, Lucinda left in a fury, and the wound she left behind never fully closed. It festered into something worse than heartbreak. It became a conviction that no woman could love him for himself alone, that his wealth would always be the true object of any woman's affection, that the only way to find genuine love was to strip away every advantage and present himself as a man with nothing to offer but his own two hands. So when Caleb placed an advertisement in the Boston Herald seeking a wife, he described himself not as the owner of 17,000 acres and 4,000 head of cattle, but as a simple ranch hand working on a large spread. He wanted a woman who would come to him for the right reasons. He wanted to know before he gave his heart again. Emmett Hargrove, the ranch foreman, stood by the stove pouring coffee with the careful movements of a man trying very hard not to speak his mind. Emmett was 45, built like a barrel with a weathered face and a gray-streaked beard, and eyes that had seen enough of the world to know foolishness when it stood in front of him wearing a borrowed shirt. He had worked for the Hawthorne family for 20 years, since old Josiah was still alive, and he loved these boys like they were his own blood, which was precisely why the deception sat so poorly with him. "When she arrives," Caleb said, turning to face them all, "she believes I am a ranch hand. Wyatt, you and Silas are fellow hands. The ranch belongs to a man named Hawthorne, our father's name. It is technically true. The town has been asked to keep the secret, and most have agreed." "Most," Emmett repeated, his tone flat. "Emmett, I need you to call me Caleb, not boss, not sir, just Caleb." Emmett looked at him for a long moment, then poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it over with an expression that could have curdled milk. "I will do my best," he said. "Sir." It was the last time he would use the word offered, as a quiet protest that everyone in the room understood. Caleb picked up the bundle of wildflowers he had gathered that morning from the meadow behind the cabin. Columbine, an Indian paintbrush, and wild daisies tied with a length of twine, just as he had promised in his last letter to Clara Whitfield of Boston. It was a small gesture, genuine and tender, and it stood in strange contrast to the elaborate lie he was about to tell. Silas caught his arm at the door. His voice was low, meant only for Caleb. "Whatever happens, remember she is a person, Cal, not a test subject." Caleb nodded, but the words settled in his chest like a burr he could not reach, and they stayed there as he rode toward Copper Ridge Station under the wide Wyoming sky. The afternoon sun beat down on the wooden platform of Copper Ridge Station as the clock above the ticket window crept toward 3:15. The station was small even by frontier standards. One building with a ticket window and a bench and a water trough for horses. A handful of locals had gathered on the platform and along the street, some genuinely waiting for passengers, others drawn by the rumor that had spread through town like wildfire. One of the Hawthorne boys was meeting his mail-order bride, and the whole affair promised to be the most entertaining thing to happen in Copper Ridge since old Fredrickson's mule escaped and wandered into the Sunday service. Caleb stood on the platform with his wildflowers, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his teeth. He had exchanged dozens of letters with Clara Whitfield over the past 4 months, and her words had already begun to reshape something inside him. She wrote with intelligence and humor, and a quiet courage that came through in every carefully penned line. She described herself as a 24-year-old seamstress who had lost both parents to consumption within 6 months of each other. She wrote of her love for books, her skill with needle and thread, and her dream of starting fresh in the American West. She described her appearance as of average quality with nothing remarkable, save perhaps my eyes, which my mother said were the color of cornflowers. Caleb had tried to keep his expectations modest. Letters could deceive. People could present idealized versions of themselves on paper. He knew this better than most, given that he was doing exactly that. The train whistle echoed across the prairie. Then came the hissing of steam and the screeching of brakes, and the 3:15 from Cheyenne pulled into Copper Ridge Station with all the noise and ceremony that a two-car train could muster. Passengers began to step down. A businessman in a bowler hat, a family with 3 small children, 2 cattlemen with dust on their coats and tobacco in their cheeks. Caleb scanned each face, searching for the woman who had written those remarkable letters. Then she appeared in the doorway of the passenger car, and everything Caleb Hawthorne had planned crumbled into dust. Because he had prepared for everything except falling in love at first sight. Clara Whitfield was not what he expected. She was more. Not simply beautiful, though she was beautiful far beyond her modest self-description. What struck Caleb, what stopped his breath and held it, was the quality of her presence. She stood in the train doorway and looked out at the small Wyoming town with an expression that held nervousness and determination and curiosity and something that looked remarkably like joy, all at once, all layered together in a face that was utterly, completely alive. She was afraid. That much was clear. But she was also thrilled. She had chosen this. She was here because she wanted to be, not because she had no other option. She wore a navy blue traveling dress, well made, slightly dusty from the 3-day journey. Her honey blonde hair was pinned beneath a simple traveling hat, with soft tendrils escaping around her temples. She carried a small bag in one hand. Her trunk was being unloaded from the baggage car behind her. When her eyes found his, when she spotted the tall man holding wildflowers exactly as he had described in his last letter, Clara Whitfield smiled. And that smile, genuine and brave and touched with vulnerability, hit Caleb Hawthorne like a fist to the chest. He felt something crack open inside him, something he had sealed shut after Lucinda, something he had convinced himself was dead. It was not simply attraction, though Lord knew that was there in full measure. It was recognition, as though he were seeing someone he had known his entire life but was meeting for the very first time. She walked toward him. Each step closer made the guilt heavier and the love more certain, and by the time she stood before him, Caleb Hawthorne knew two things with absolute clarity. He loved this woman, and he was lying to her. Mr. Hawthorne, her voice carried the refined accent of educated Boston society, but it was warm, musical, the kind of voice a man could listen to for 50 years and never tire of hearing. Yes, ma'am, that is me. His own voice came out rougher than he intended. He thrust the wildflowers toward her with hands that trembled slightly, a trembling he disguised by pretending to adjust his grip on the stems. Clara accepted the flowers with genuine pleasure, lifting them to her nose to breathe in their scent. Her eyes closed for just a moment, and when they opened again, those remarkable cornflower blue eyes studied his face with an intelligence that made his stomach drop. "You are quite different from what I imagined, from your letters," she said. Caleb felt panic rise in his throat. "Different how? Taller and far more handsome than you described yourself. You were entirely too modest in your correspondence, Mr. Hawthorne." Relief flooded through him like warm water, and right behind it came guilt so sharp it felt like a blade between his ribs. Here stood this remarkable woman placing her trust in him completely, and he was lying to her from the very first word. Across the street in the doorway of the White Pine Saloon, Wyatt Hawthorne watched the meeting unfold. He had ridden ahead to observe officially to make sure Clara actually got off the train privately, because his curiosity about the woman who had captured his brother's attention through letters alone was more intense than he wanted to admit. He saw Caleb's face when Clara stepped down, and he recognized the expression because he had never seen it on his eldest brother before. Not with Lucinda, not with anyone. Caleb was in love. Not interested, not attracted. In love. Completely and irreversibly gone. Wyatt felt a complicated knot of emotions. Happiness for his brother, amusement at the absurdity of the situation, and something else. Something he could not name when he got his first clear look at Clara Whitfield and saw the courage shining in those blue eyes. He pushed that unnamed feeling aside with practiced ease. He would remember this moment later and wish he had paid more attention to it. Caleb loaded Clara's belongings onto the borrowed supply wagon. One large trunk and one small traveling bag. Everything she owned in the world. The wagon was deliberately decrepit, another prop in the performance, a hard wooden seat with no cushions, an old horse that Caleb had chosen specifically because it looked nothing like the magnificent animals in the Hawthorne stables. As they left Copper Ridge behind and followed the dusty road northeast, Clara began to talk, and the magic that had lived in her letters translated into spoken conversation with an ease that astonished them both. She was curious about everything: the grasslands stretching to the horizon, the hawks circling overhead, the distant peaks still wearing caps of early snow, despite the autumn warmth in the valley. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, her eyes wide with the landscape. Your letters mentioned it was a large spread, but I confess I have no real understanding of what that means. Caleb guided the horses, carefully choosing his words with equal care. It is the Hawthorne Ranch, 17,000 acres give or take, more cattle than a man can count. I have been working there for years, know every creek and canyon on the property. All of this was technically true. He simply left out the part where he owned every one of those 17,000 acres. And this Mr. Hawthorne, your employer, is he a fair man? Fair enough, Caleb said, and thought wryly that he ought to know. The place could use a woman's touch, I will say that. Clara told him about her life in Boston. She spoke of her parents with love and grief, still fresh of her work as a seamstress with quiet pride. I brought my sewing supplies, she said. I do not wish to be idle or a burden. The word burden struck Caleb like a hammer blow. Here was a woman not seeking rescue. She was seeking partnership. She wanted to contribute to build to earn her place. It was precisely what he had hoped to find and feared he never would. The road crossed a ridge and the entire valley opened before them. Grasslands rolling like a green ocean. Mountains painted purple and gold by the afternoon light. The silver thread of Willow Creek winding through cottonwood groves. And above it all, a sky so vast and blue it seemed to have no end. Clara fell silent, her lips parted. For a long moment, she simply looked, and Caleb watched the wonder move across her face like weather. It is so beautiful, she whispered, so enormous, so different from everything I have known. A thread of fear wound through the wonder. Is it very lonely out here? It can be, Caleb admitted, especially in winter when the storms come and you might not see another soul for weeks. That is part of why I wrote to you, Clara. A man needs someone to share his life with. And then, surprising himself with his own honesty, he added quietly, I have been lonely a long time. She turned to look at him and something shifted between them. An understanding, a recognition of mutual need that went deeper than the practical arrangement of a mail-order marriage. Well, Clara said softly, I hope I shall prove better company than your horse. They came to a crossroads. The left fork led to the small cabin Caleb had prepared. The right fork led to the real Hawthorne Ranch house with its 6 bedrooms and its library and its wraparound porch overlooking the valley. For one agonizing moment, Caleb hesitated. He could feel the reins in his hands, the leather warm from the sun, and the choice before him felt as physical as the fork in the road. Tell her now. Show her the truth. Trust that this woman, this extraordinary woman who had crossed a continent, because his letters made her feel seen, would love him for who he was rather than what he owned. The temptation was so strong it felt like a hand on the reins pulling right. But fear won. Fear of another Lucinda. Fear of another betrayal. Fear that the love he saw in those blue eyes would turn to calculation the moment she learned the truth. Fear always won with Caleb Hawthorne, at least when it came to matters of the heart. And so he turned left toward the cabin and the lie and carried the woman he loved deeper into the deception he had built. Clara woke on her second morning in the Wyoming Territory to the sound of a rooster crowing and sunlight pouring through curtainless windows. The cabin was smaller than she had imagined in the full light of day, but it was solid. The walls were chinked tight against the wind with a mixture of mud and straw that spoke of careful hands. The cast iron stove held its heat through the night, the coals still glowing when she lifted the lid and felt the warmth rise against her face. The single window in the bedroom framed a view of the creek below, where mist curled off the water in the early chill, and beyond it the meadow stretched to the dark line of pines at the base of the mountains. Somewhere in those pines, a woodpecker hammered its morning rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. When she opened the bedroom door, she found Caleb already up, his bedroll, neatly stowed in the corner of the main room, a pot of coffee steaming on the stove. The smell of it filled the cabin, rich and dark, mingling with the lingering scent of oak smoke from last night's fire. He had already been outside. She could see the mud on his boots and the faint dampness on his collar where the morning dew had touched him. They negotiated their arrangement that morning over 10 cups of coffee on the porch, with the creek murmuring behind them and the chickens conducting their daily inspection of the yard. I will take the bedroom for now, Clara said. You keep the main room. I will handle the cooking and the garden. You handle the hunting and the firewood. We will see how this arrangement works for both of us. No obligations beyond that. Caleb nodded. That is fair. But I want one thing more. I want to learn about the ranch, about this land, about life out here. I do not want to sit idle and wait. I want to be a partner, Mr. Hawthorne, not a burden. A partner, not a burden. The words echoed in Caleb's mind long after the conversation ended. This was a woman who had crossed a continent not to be kept but to contribute, not to be rescued but to stand beside someone and build. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt to both of them like something they had been waiting for without knowing it. Mornings, Caleb taught Clara the practicalities of frontier life. She learned to feed the chickens and promptly named each one: Charlotte, Jane, Emily, Anne, Louisa May, and George. All authors, every single one. Caleb recognized the references and felt a smile tug at his mouth, which he suppressed because a simple ranch hand should not know the Bronte sisters by first name. She learned to check the hen house for eggs, running her fingers into the straw nests, with a mix of eagerness and apprehension that Caleb found impossibly endearing. He showed her how to inspect the chicken wire for gaps where coyotes might squeeze through, how to fill the water trough from the oak barrel he kept by the well. Each morning, Caleb left the cabin, telling Clara he was riding out to his work on the ranch. In truth, he rode to the main house to manage the real business of Hawthorne Creek Ranch before returning in the late afternoon. The stories he told her each evening about his day were based on actual ranch work carefully reframed so that he was the worker rather than the boss. He told her about mending cedar fence posts that a bull had knocked loose, driving 8-pound stakes into hard ground with a post maul until his shoulders burned. About moving 200 head of cattle from summer pasture to lower ground before the first real cold, 4 riders and 2 dogs working the herd across 3 miles of open grassland. About checking on expectant cows by lantern light in a coal barn, sometimes helping with a difficult birth, his hands slick and his heart racing as he coaxed new life into the world. About breaking horses, which was really Wyatt's specialty, but Caleb knew enough to describe the process with authority, the patience, the rope work, the body language, the low, steady voice that told a wild animal it was safe to trust. These were true stories. Every detail was authentic. The only lie was in who was telling them. Afternoons while Caleb was away, Clara explored. She walked the banks of Willow Creek and discovered meadows thick with late wildflowers. She heard eagles crying overhead and watched deer drink from the shallows at dusk. And she began with the quiet determination that defined her to turn the cabin into a home. She sewed curtains from fabric she had brought in her trunk, bright yellow calico patterned with small blue flowers. She hung them in every window, and the cabin, which had been merely clean before, suddenly felt warm, alive, like someone lived there who cared about beauty. She organized the kitchen with a seamstress's precision, finding a place for every pot and tin and utensil. She attacked the vegetable garden with more enthusiasm than experience, and Caleb had to gently redirect her when she began pulling up young carrot tops she had mistaken for weeds. "Those are carrots," he said, catching her wrist lightly before she could yank another one from the soil. "They look exactly like weeds. Most good things do at first." He had not meant it as a metaphor, but something in the way Clara looked at him when he said it told him she had heard one anyway. Evenings were the best, the dangerous part, the part where Caleb forgot he was playing a role and simply became himself. Clara cooked simple meals from limited supplies: beans simmered with salt pork, cornbread baked on the cast iron, tea brewed in a tin kettle. Caleb brought back trout from the creek, cleaned and filleted with a skill that came from years of practice. They ate on the porch as the sun went down, watching the mountains turn from gold to amber to a deep purple that bled into the first stars. And Clara read to him poetry and prose and passages from her father's worn copy of Thoreau's Walden, the pages soft with handling and love. Her voice in the evening air with the creek behind them and the fire crackling inside was the most peaceful sound Caleb had ever heard. The problem was that Caleb himself was a reader, a serious one. His library in the main house held over 1,000 volumes, and in the intimacy of those evenings with Clara's voice weaving literature into the darkness, he found himself slipping. He caught literary allusions too quickly. He made references that a man without formal education should not know. He responded to ideas with a sophistication that did not match his borrowed clothes. Clara noticed. He could see it in the way her eyes narrowed sometimes, the way she tilted her head when he said something that did not fit. But she interpreted these moments charitably as signs that Caleb was smarter and better read than he gave himself credit for. She did not yet suspect the truth. She simply thought she had found a more remarkable man than she had expected, which in a way she had, just not in the way she imagined. On the third morning, Clara found a book. She was cleaning behind the cast iron stove, reaching into the narrow gap between iron and wall to sweep out accumulated dust when her fingers touched leather. She pulled out a volume bound in dark calfskin, the pages edged in gold. Marcus Aurelius, The Meditations. A beautiful edition. The kind of book that cost more than a ranch hand earned in a month. She held it up when Caleb came in from chopping wood, and there was a question in her cornflower eyes that he felt like a cold draft. "This is a beautiful edition," she said carefully. "Quite expensive, I would think." His heart kicked hard against his ribs. "It was my mother's," he said quickly, and this at least was true. Catherine Hawthorne had given him that book on his 20th birthday. She was a great reader. Clara accepted the explanation. She set the book on the shelf beside her own small collection and said no more about it. But Caleb saw the way she filed the observation away, adding it to the small collection of inconsistencies she was quietly accumulating. His vocabulary, his table manners, the authority in his voice when he spoke about the ranch, the calfskin Marcus Aurelius that no ranch hand's mother should have been able to afford. The seeds were there, waiting for rain. On the sixth night the rain came. Not the gentle kind, the Wyoming kind. Wind slammed through the valley like a freight train. Hail hammered the cabin roof with a sound like gravel poured from heaven. Thunder shook the walls so hard that tin cups rattled on their hooks. Lightning turned the world white and left after images burned into their eyes. Outside, the chickens screamed in their coop, and the creek, usually so gentle, roared with sudden fury. Clara sat at the table with her hands flat on the wood and her back straight and her eyes wide. She was afraid. Caleb could see it in the set of her jaw, in the whiteness of her knuckles. But she did not cry. She did not ask him to hold her. She sat with her spine like iron and her courage like a flame that the wind could bend but not extinguish. "It will pass," Caleb told her. "Winter always ends." He did not know why he said it that way. Winter had not begun. But the words felt right, and Clara seemed to draw strength from them, and outside the storm raged on, while inside the cabin, two people sat in the warm circle of lamplight and waited together. By morning, the storm had broken a cottonwood tree across the creek, damming the water and threatening to flood the garden. Caleb took his axe to the trunk while Clara hauled branches. The work was hard and wet and cold. Clara's hands blistered within the first hour. Caleb saw the raw red skin when she paused to wipe her forehead. "Let me see those," he said. She pulled her hands back. "They are fine." "Clara," she showed him. The blisters were angry and weeping. Without a word, she tore a strip from the hem of her petticoat, wrapped both hands, and went back to hauling branches. Caleb stood there with his axe in his hands and something new in his chest. Not just love now, respect. Deep, genuine, unshakable respect for a woman who wrapped her bleeding hands and went back to work without complaint because the job was not finished yet. That evening, over a dinner of creek trout and cornbread sitting on the porch they had cleared of storm debris, Caleb told Clara about his father. He had not planned to. The words simply came drawn out by the firelight, in the quiet, in the way she listened, which was different from anyone he had ever known. She listened with her whole self, eyes and ears and heart all open and all focused. He told her how Josiah Hawthorne had taught him to set his first fence post when he was 12 years old. How his father woke before dawn every single morning and wrote out with the same words on his lips, words that Caleb heard so many times they were carved into his bones. "A man keeps his word, son. That is the only thing in this life no one can take from you." How Josiah had built the ranch from nothing, from bare dirt and borrowed money, and a stubbornness that the Wyoming wind itself could not break. How his father's horse had spooked at a rattlesnake on a mountain trail 7 years ago and thrown him into a ravine. How Caleb, 26 years old and not yet ready for the weight of the world to land on his shoulders, had ridden to the bottom of that ravine and found his father's body among the rocks and the wildflowers. His voice did not break when he told it, but his hands, those big calloused hands that could split firewood all day without trembling, shook when he set down his coffee cup. The silence after he finished was long and full. The fire popped. The wind pushed gently against the cabin walls, And in that silence, something shifted between Clara Whitfield and Caleb Hawthorne that could never shift back. My parents died 6 months apart, Clara said softly, both of consumption. My father went first. My mother, I think, simply decided to follow him. I was 21, I buried them both, and then I sat alone in a boarding house room in Boston and wondered whether the world had any use for me at all. Her voice trembled, but did not break. The control of a woman who had already done her crying. And then I found your letter, she said, and I thought there was a man asking me what I dream about. Not what I can cook or clean or mend, what I dream about. And I thought perhaps the world had a use for me after all. Caleb could not speak. The guilt was choking him. Every beautiful, honest word she said was a knife because the man she was trusting with her heart was lying to her about who he was. The days that followed deepened everything. Clara proved herself capable in a dozen small ways. She split firewood with more determination than technique, but she improved every day. She killed a snake in the garden with a hoe calmly and efficiently, and then went back to weeding as though nothing had happened. She turned the limited supplies in the cabin into meals that grew better with each attempt. Caleb found himself performing small acts of tenderness that had nothing to do with their arrangement. He left a bucket of heated water by the washroom door each morning. He fixed the wobbly leg on her chair without being asked. He brought back a coil of rope so she could hang a clothesline. Clara responded in kind. She mended the patches on his borrowed shirt, but not with rough stitching. She embroidered tiny flowers over each patch, turning the flaws into decorations. Caleb wore that shirt every single day for a week. One evening, he brought wildflowers home and set them on the kitchen table without a word. When he came back inside after tending the horses, Clara had arranged them in a tin cup, and the small cabin with its yellow curtains and its wildflower centerpiece looked more like a home than the six-bedroom ranch house had ever managed to look. And Wyatt began to visit. He came with excuses, supplies that needed delivering, messages from the boss, fence lines that needed checking near the cabin. Each visit was brief, but each one carried its own particular energy. Wyatt was charming in a way that Caleb, burdened by the weight of his deception, could not be. He told stories about ranch life with a humor and vitality that made Clara laugh, real laughter, the kind that lit up her face and made her eyes shine. On the 10th day, Wyatt rode to the cabin and found Clara sitting alone beside the creek. Her skirts were arranged around her on the grass. She held a book of Tennyson's poetry open in her lap and was reading aloud to no audience but the water and the sky. She did not hear his horse approach. Wyatt sat in the saddle and watched. Her voice carried on the afternoon breeze. Her honey blonde hair caught the golden light and seemed to glow. The expression on her face was one of absolute contentment, and it was the most beautiful thing Wyatt Hawthorne had ever seen. Something broke open inside him then, something he had spent 30 years keeping safely locked away. Clara looked up, saw him, and smiled. Open, friendly, entirely innocent. She had no idea what that smile did to him. Wyatt, come listen to this. It is Tennyson, and it is absolutely perfect for this landscape. He dismounted. He sat beside the creek. They talked for an hour about poetry and horse, and the way the light fell differently in autumn. And when he rode home that evening with the sun going down behind the mountains, Wyatt Hawthorne understood with a clarity that felt like grief that he was falling in love with his brother's bride. But what was growing in Wyatt Hawthorne's heart would prove to be the fuse on something far larger. And when it finally detonated, no one would walk away whole. The first touch between Clara and Caleb came on the 11th day during a riding lesson. Caleb was teaching her to ride in the meadow behind the cabin. The horse was a gentle brown mare named Penny, borrowed like everything else in this charade. Clara sat in the saddle with the careful posture of a woman accustomed to chairs and carriages, not livestock. Caleb stood beside her, one hand on the bridle, the other on the reins near her own hand guiding. Their fingers touched on the leather. Both of them felt it, a stillness, a held breath, the world narrowing to the point where skin met skin on a worn strip of cowhide. Then they both withdrew. Neither spoke, but the air between them changed charge now, with something neither could name and neither could ignore. That night, after Caleb had fallen asleep on his bedroll in the main room, Clara rose from her bed and crossed quietly to the doorway. She looked at him sleeping. His face was softer in rest, less guarded, younger. The hard line of his jaw relaxed. The furrow between his brows smoothed away. She took a blanket from the shelf and laid it over him, careful not to wake him. She stood there for a moment longer, watching him breathe, and then she returned to her room. For the first time since she had arrived at the cabin, she did not lock the door. She was not sure what it meant, but she thought perhaps he would understand. On the 12th evening, the town of Copper Ridge held its monthly social at the one-room schoolhouse. Clara had sewn a new dress for the occasion. Soft blue cotton that matched her eyes with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs that showcased her extraordinary skill with a needle. When she stepped out of the bedroom wearing it, Caleb lost his breath. She was radiant with the quiet happiness of a woman who believed she had found her place in the world. At the social, Clara was warmly received by the community, partly from genuine friendliness, partly from the complicated mixture of guilt, curiosity, and complicity that every person in Copper Ridge carried because every person in Copper Ridge knew the secret. The evening was a minefield of near disasters. Mr. Fredrickson, the general store owner, nearly addressed Caleb as Mr. Hawthorne before catching himself mid-syllable. A rancher's wife started to mention the Hawthorne ranch house before her husband's elbow found her ribs. Across the room, Wyatt watched Clara with an expression he could not quite control, and Silas, standing beside him, noticed everything and said nothing. But the moment that changed everything came near the end of the evening when Clara stepped outside to catch her breath. She was standing beside the schoolhouse wall in the cool night air when she heard voices. Two women speaking in the low tones of people who believe they are alone. "I feel terrible about this," Mrs. Parsons whispered. "That poor girl has no idea. She thinks she married a ranch hand. Well, she has not married him yet. They are not formally wed." Mrs. Webb's voice was hushed but firm. "And Caleb Hawthorne has his reasons, I suppose. But those brothers and their little game, it does not sit right with me." Clara froze. Caleb Hawthorne. Those brothers. Their little game. The words rearranged themselves in her mind like puzzle pieces, snapping together. She did not understand the full picture yet, but she knew now with the certainty of a woman whose intelligence had been quietly gathering evidence for 12 days that something was deeply wrong. That the people of Copper Ridge knew something about Caleb that she did not, that his brothers were part of it, and that whatever the secret was, it had been treated by an entire town as a form of entertainment. Clara did not confront anyone that night. This was crucial to who she was. She was not impulsive. She processed. She analyzed. She gathered information before she acted. She went back inside and danced with Caleb when he offered his hand, and she smiled when the music played, and she laughed at the right moments. She let him guide her through a waltz she did not quite know the steps to, and when he steadied her with his hand on the small of her back, she did not pull away. She memorized the warmth of his palm through the fabric of her dress. She watched his face while they danced, that serious, handsome face with its amber eyes and its 2 days stubble, and she thought about how much she loved this man and how terrifying it was to love someone while suspecting that the ground beneath you might not be solid. No one looking at her would have known that behind those cornflower blue eyes, a storm was building that would make the one on the sixth night look like a summer breeze. On the ride home, she was quieter than usual. Caleb noticed and attributed it to tiredness. He did not see that the walls of his careful deception had begun to crack. He did not know that Clara Whitfield was no longer an innocent bride. She had become, in the space of a whispered conversation, a detective. And what she was about to uncover would either shatter her heart or break the man she loved. But the hardest part was still to come, and neither of them was ready for it. Clara Whitfield spent 2 days watching. She did not confront Caleb. She did not ask questions she was not ready to hear the answers to. She simply opened her eyes, the eyes that had been softened by affection and trust, and she looked at the man she had been falling in love with through the clear and unforgiving lens of suspicion. She noticed things. She noticed the way Caleb quoted Marcus Aurelius from memory, not haltingly, the way a man who had stumbled across a single book might, but fluently the way a man who had read widely and deeply would. She noticed the authority in his voice when he spoke about the ranch, not the deference of a hired hand describing his employer's property, but the weight of an owner speaking about what was his. She noticed the way Colt Brennan, the ranch hand, who sometimes rode past the cabin, tipped his hat and lowered his eyes when Caleb was near. The body language of a man before his boss, not beside his equal. She noticed the calfskin Marcus Aurelius on the shelf, the one she had found behind the stove. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands and thought about how much it must have cost and what kind of ranch hand's mother could afford such a gift. The pieces were all there. She was simply assembling them. On the afternoon of the 14th day, Clara asked Caleb to continue her riding lessons. They were walking toward the small corral near the cabin, the October sun warm on their shoulders, the smell of dried grass and wood smoke hanging in the still air, when the sound of hoofbeats broke the quiet. Emmett Hargrove came riding into the clearing at a gallop, his barrel chest heaving, his weathered face flushed red with urgency. "Boss, we got trouble with the North herd. 20 head broke through the fence line and there is a—" He stopped. The word died in his throat. His face went from red to white in the space of a heartbeat as his eyes found Clara standing 3 feet from Caleb, her cornflower blue eyes locked on his with an expression that told him everything he needed to know about what he had just done. 2 weeks of careful deception, 14 days of watching every word, controlling every interaction, maintaining the fiction with the desperate precision of a man defusing a bomb. And Emmett Hargrove, loyal to a fault, careful beyond measure, had destroyed it all with a single word spoken in a moment of genuine emergency. "Boss." Clara repeated it, softly, the way a person repeats a word in a foreign language they have just learned the meaning of. "Boss." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Caleb Hawthorne had ever heard. Clara looked at him, and this time there was no confusion in her eyes, no charitable interpretation. There was only the cold, precise click of puzzle pieces falling into their final positions. The whispered conversation at the town social, the expensive book, the deference of the ranch hands, the vocabulary that did not match the borrowed clothes, the authority that did not match the role. "You are not Caleb Hawthorne, the ranch hand," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady, devastating. "You are Caleb Hawthorne, the owner." "Yes." The word fell from his mouth like a stone into deep water. "I am. And Wyatt and Silas, they are your brothers. They own this ranch with you." "Yes." And everyone in town knew, everyone at that social, Mrs. Crawford, the Reverend, the store owner, they all knew. They were all part of this performance. "Clara, I can explain." "Why?" The single word cut through his explanation before it could begin. Clara was not screaming. She was not crying. She stood with her spine straight and her chin lifted and her blue eye burning with something worse than anger. Disappointment. The bone-deep disappointment of a woman who had trusted completely and been deceived completely and was now standing in the wreckage of that trust with her dignity as her only remaining weapon. Caleb told her everything. Lucinda Garrett, the betrayal, the canceled wedding, the fear that had festered for 5 years, the advertisement, the cabin, the borrowed clothes, the test. Clara listened to every word. Understanding made her judgment more devastating, not less. "You discovered all of that," she said slowly, "by lying to me from the moment we met." "Everything I felt was real, Clara. Every conversation, every moment. You put me through a test, Mr. Hawthorne, without my knowledge or consent. You made me prove myself worthy of your love, while you proved yourself to be a liar." Clara turned to Emmett. "Mr. Hargrove, would you please arrange to take me back to town tomorrow morning? I will be staying at Mrs. Crawford's boarding house." "Yes, ma'am, and ma'am, I am sorry. I should have told you myself." "Yes," Clara agreed without cruelty. "You should have." That night, Clara stayed in the cabin bedroom. Caleb sat on the porch in the dark, and through the thin walls he heard Clara crying. It was soft and brief, as though she had allowed herself a measured portion of grief and then stopped. The sound of her controlled, dignified weeping was the worst thing Caleb Hawthorne had ever heard. In the morning, Emmett arrived with a proper carriage. Clara had repacked her trunk. She had changed back into her navy blue traveling dress and pinned her hair beneath her hat as though she were rewinding time. "Clara." She turned. Her face was composed but distant. "Yes, Mr. Hawthorne. I love you. I know I have no right to say it, but everything we shared was real." For one moment her composure wavered. Her lower lip trembled. Then she steadied herself. "Perhaps it was," she said softly, "but love built on lies is not love, Mr. Hawthorne. It is just wishful thinking." She climbed into the carriage. Emmett drove her away. Caleb stood on the porch and watched until they disappeared over the ridge. Clara's yellow curtains still hung in the windows. Her garden was beginning to wilt. Charlotte, the boldest of the chickens, hopped up onto the porch and regarded Caleb with an expression he would have sworn was accusation. The richest man in 3 counties stood alone in an empty cabin, and for the first time in his life, all the money in the world could not buy the only thing he wanted. Caleb Hawthorne dealt with heartbreak the way he dealt with everything. He worked. He rose before dawn when the stars were still burning cold above the mountains and the frost lay thick on the grass. He rode until dark, until his horse was lathered and stumbling. He mended fences that did not need mending, stringing barbed wire in the cold until his gloves were shredded and his fingers bled through the calluses. He moved cattle that did not need moving. He dug post holes with an 8-pound maul until his shoulders screamed and his hands were so raw that the maul handle came away bloody when he set it down, and then he picked it up and dug more. He did not go near the cabin beside Willow Creek. He could not bear to see those yellow curtains in the windows of an empty house, could not bear to walk past the garden where Clara had pulled up carrots by mistake, could not bear the sight of the porch where they had sat together reading Thoreau while the stars came out. On the 16th morning, Wyatt found Silas in the horse barn at dawn. The barn smelled of hay and leather and horse sweat, and the light came through the slats and golden bars that striped the straw floor. "I need to tell you something," Wyatt said, "and I need you not to judge me." Silas waited. "I have feelings for Clara." The words hung in the barn air, dust motes drifting through them. "I did not plan it, I did not want it, but I need to say it out loud to someone before it eats me alive." "I know," Silas said. "I have known since the 2nd week." "What do I do?" "You do nothing. She is not yours. She was never yours. She is not Cal's either, not anymore. And if she were free, would you pursue her?" Wyatt struggled with his answer for a long time. "No, because even if Cal does not deserve her, she deserves to make that choice without me complicating it. And because Cal is my brother. And whatever he has done, that means something to me. It means everything." Then Silas told Wyatt about the letter. He had found it in their mother's Bible in the attic. A sealed envelope, the red wax unbroken, their mother's handwriting on the front. "To be opened when the first of my sons brings home a bride." Neither opened it. They agreed to wait. But the letter's existence settled into the house like a presence, a voice from beyond the grave waiting to speak. While the Hawthorne brothers navigated their crisis, Clara Whitfield set about building a life. She moved into Mrs. Crawford's boarding house. Mrs. Crawford was 58, widowed, sharp-tongued, and warm-hearted. "Come in, dear. I have strong coffee and a room with a view of the mountains, both of which you are going to need." Clara did not collapse. On her 2nd morning, she unpacked her sewing supplies and began taking commissions. Within a week, she had more work than she could handle. She helped at the schoolhouse reading to children during lunch breaks. The women of the town nodded to each other in that silent frontier communication. "This one is worth keeping." At night, alone in her room, Clara wrestled with something harder than grief. She replayed every moment at the cabin, trying to separate what was real from what was performance. The conversations were real. The way he looked at her was real. You cannot rehearse a tremor, but his silence was a lie. Every day he chose not to tell her the truth was a choice. He had chosen the test over the trust. She heard about Caleb through Mrs. Crawford's gossip network, that he was working himself into the ground, that the chickens were being fed by Emmett Hargrove. She heard about Caleb's past acts of charity. Mrs. Patterson told her about the anonymous mortgage payment, the scholarship fund, years of quiet generosity. This information answered Clara's central question. Caleb's kindness existed long before she arrived. He had not been pretending to be good-hearted. He had been pretending to be poor. And that distinction mattered enormously. 3 weeks after Clara's departure, a private carriage rolled into Copper Ridge carrying Jedediah Thorne. He was 50, impeccably dressed, accompanied by a lawyer in spectacles and 2 hired men who wore their revolvers low. Thorne's face was narrow and clean-shaven, his eyes the pale gray of creek ice, and his smile had the warmth of a closed bank door. Thorne was a cattle baron from Laramie who built his empire through acquisition. He bought debt. He purchased mortgages. He accumulated land by waiting for others to fail. His target in Copper Ridge was water. 3 creeks ran through the valley, and the Hawthorne family controlled the rights to all of them. He began calling in debts. the Pattersons, old Frederickson, the Millers. One by one, Thorne's lawyer appeared at doors with papers and polite smiles. Caleb organized the community's response. He called meetings. He offered Hawthorne resources. He rode from ranch to ranch, promising that no one would lose their land. The man who had been destroying himself with grief channeled that energy into something larger. Clara watched from the boarding house, and something shifted inside her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. The man fighting for his neighbors was the same man who had told her stories by firelight. The deception had been about circumstance, not character. On the 28th day, she saw him outside the general store. He looked terrible, gaunt, dark circles beneath his amber eyes, his clothes hanging on him. They walked to the park behind the church. They sat at opposite ends of a bench. I need you to know that I understand now why what I did was wrong. I told myself I was protecting both of us, but I was only protecting myself. I was afraid. And instead of trusting you, I built a wall of lies and called it a test. Clara's reply elevated the conflict beyond a quarrel. You have made it impossible for me to trust my own feelings. Everything I felt for you in that cabin, now I have to question whether any of it was real, because the context was fabricated. They parted without resolution, but they parted having spoken honestly, and that was a beginning. On the 32nd day, Thorne overplayed his hand at the monthly social. He laid out his vision for the valley. Development, progress. What he meant was annexation. Caleb rose to face him. Mr. Thorne, no one in this valley is selling to you. Thorne smiled. The law is on my side. The notes I hold are legal instruments. And then Clara spoke. She stepped forward from among the women and children she had befriended. Mr. Thorne, I am a seamstress, not a lawyer, but I have read enough to know that debt notes purchased at a discount from families in distress can be challenged in court if coercion is demonstrated. And I also know that in the Wyoming Territory, women have held the right to vote since 1869, which means half the people in this room have a legal voice, and they stand with their honest neighbors, not with a man who profits from other people's misfortune. The room erupted with applause. Mrs. Dunn. Crawford murmured, that girl from Boston has more steel in her spine than Jedediah Thorne has in his whole operation. Caleb looked across the room at Clara and understood something with the force of revelation. She did not need to be rescued. She needed to be trusted. That was the one thing he had failed to give her. Then the Chinook came and it changed everything. A warm wind blew down from the mountains in the dead of February, the kind of fall spring that the old-timers called a snow eater. It melted the high country snowpack in 3 days flat, and the runoff had nowhere to go but down. Rain came behind the warm wind, 3 days of relentless downpour, driven by southern gusts that smelled of mud and distant thunder, and the combination of snowmelt and rain turned every gully and draw into a rushing channel. The creeks swelled beyond their banks. The meadows became shallow lakes. Ranch roads turned to rivers of brown water that swallowed wagon wheels to the axles. 5 months after Clara's arrival in Copper Ridge, Willow Creek, the same gentle creek that had murmured beside the cabin where she and Caleb had built their brief and shattered happiness, burst through a natural dam upstream and sent a wall of brown water roaring through the lower valley with a sound like a freight train bearing down in the dark. Families were trapped. Caleb organized the rescue. Wyatt rode upstream. Emmett led a team to the Pattersons. Silas was sent to check on the Frederickson property near Willow Creek. The floodwaters were rising faster than anyone anticipated. His horse panicked at the crossing, reared, and threw him. The current took Silas downstream. He caught himself on a fallen cottonwood, his leg trapped between submerged branches. The water rose around him. The tree groaned with each surge. Word reached the schoolhouse. Clara did not hesitate. She borrowed a horse from the livery, a skill she had barely learned in 2 weeks at a cabin, and rode hard toward the roar of water. The creek was now a churning brown torrent, 20 feet wide. Silas clung to the fallen cottonwood water at his chest, face white with cold. Clara tied a rope around her waist. She stepped into the water. The cold hit her like a fist. The current tore at her skirts. She found the rocks with her feet testing each step. The water rose to her waist, to her ribs. She reached the tree. Your leg. Can you move it? Trapped. She plunged her arms into the icy water and worked to free his leg. Minutes passed. The water reached her chest. Her fingers were numb, but she did not stop. The branch gave way. Silas cried out in pain. Clara wrapped the rope around both of them and signaled the ranch hands on the bank. They pulled. The crossing back was brutal. They were dragged under twice, but the rope held. Caleb arrived minutes later. He found Silas on the bank with his legs splinted and Clara kneeling beside him, soaked through, shaking violently. "She saved my life," Silas said simply. Caleb dropped to his knees. "Are you hurt?" "I am fine. Your brother needs a doctor." The flood lasted 3 more days. The schoolhouse became a shelter. Clara organized kitchens, sewed garments for families who had lost everything, read to frightened children. And she saw the Hawthorne brothers as they truly were. Leaders, protectors, men who used their wealth for the good of others. Wyatt, watching Clara comfort a crying child while directing ranch hands to distribute blankets, felt something settle inside him. His feelings for Clara were admiration, not love, the way Caleb loved her. He could live with admiration. On the 3rd evening alone in the schoolhouse, Clara asked Caleb directly, "Is this who you really are? This man who opens his home to strangers and works alongside his ranch hands?" "Yes, this is who I have always been. The man I fell in love with in that cabin. Was that real?" Every moment. She told him about Mrs. Patterson, the anonymous mortgage, the scholarship. "It matters," Clara said, "because it tells me you were not pretending to be kind and generous. You were pretending to be poor." "Does that make a difference?" "It makes all the difference. It means that when I fell in love with you in that cabin, I was falling in love with your true heart. The setting was false, but the heart was real." While the community rebuilt, Thorne purchased additional debt from flood-weakened families. Silas uncovered that Thorne had bought the bank's entire loan portfolio. Every mortgage in the valley was now in Thorne's hands. Caleb made his decision. "Buy them, one of them, every note. Whatever Thorne paid, I will pay more." "That is nearly a third of our liquid assets," Silas warned. "Then we rebuild, the way Father did." Caleb found Thorne at the White Pine Saloon. "I am buying every note you hold, your price plus 20%, and then you leave this valley." Thorne laughed. "You will bankrupt yourself." "Maybe, but every family in this valley will be free." He gathered every family at the Church of the Good Shepherd on a Sunday evening. He stood at the front with a wooden box full of papers and a candle burning on the altar. One by one he read each family's name and fed their debt papers to the flame. The Pattersons, the Millers, old Frederickson, each paper consumed by fire, each chain broken. "You owe nothing, not to Thorne, not to me. This is your home, this is your land, and no one is taking it from you." The church erupted. Men wept, women embraced. Old Frederickson covered his face with his hat and wept like a boy. Clara stood at the back and watched the man she loved set fire to his own fortune to save a community. This was not a performance. This was the true heart of Caleb Hawthorne. A man keeps his word. And on that night, Caleb Hawthorne kept his word, not to one person, but to an entire valley. Clara walked back to the boarding house under the stars. For the first time since the truth was revealed, she left the door inside her chest open. Just a crack. Just enough for what might come next. The morning after the flood waters began to recede, Silas Hawthorne sat in the library of the main house with a sealed envelope in his hands and a decision in his heart. The library was the finest room in the Hawthorne home. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls holding over 1,000 volumes. Josiah Hawthorne's desk sat before the window, solid oak, scarred by decades of use. The envelope was yellowed with age. The red wax seal, stamped with a small letter C, was unbroken. Caleb arrived first. He looked better than he had in weeks. Wyatt came in behind him. Silas broke the seal and began to read aloud. "My dear boys, if you are reading this, then one of you has finally found the courage to bring a woman home, and I am not there to welcome her. I have watched you grow into strong men, all 3 of you, and I am proud. But I have also watched each of you build walls, and that worries me more than anything the frontier has ever thrown at this family." To Caleb, she wrote, "You have your father's strength, my darling, but you also have his stubbornness. Love cannot be controlled or tested or manufactured. It can only be received with open hands and a willingness to be hurt. The woman who comes to you will not need to be tested. She will need to be trusted. If you cannot offer her that trust, you do not deserve her love." To Wyatt, Your charm is a gift, my wild one, but you have turned it into armor. Let someone see the man behind the smile, the man who wept when his first horse died, the man who sat beside my bed and read me poetry when I was too weak to hold a book. That man is worth loving, but he has to be brave enough to be seen. To Silas, your gift for seeing the truth is precious, my quiet one. But it can become a curse if it leads you to watch and analyze instead of live and love. Sometimes the bravest thing a wise man can do is leap without looking. Then Silas reached the final paragraph and the room went very still. I have one more thing to tell you. 25 years ago, before your father and I came to Wyoming, I lived in Boston. My closest friend was a woman named Margaret Ashworth. We were inseparable, and then your father asked me to come west, and Margaret and I lost touch. She married a college lecturer, a Professor Whitfield, I believe, and had a daughter. If fate is kind, and if God has a sense of humor, perhaps one day our families will find each other again. Margaret Ashworth, who married Professor Edmund Whitfield, who had a daughter named Clara. Caleb sat with tears on his cheeks. She knew. Somehow she knew. She also warned you, Cal, Silas said. She told you not to test the woman who came to you. She told you to trust. Wyatt turned from the bookshelf, eyes red but voice steady. She told me to stop hiding behind my charm. He looked at Caleb. I need to tell you something. Wyatt told Caleb everything. His feelings for Clara, the afternoon by the creek, the weeks of fighting it. His choice. I did not pursue her. I will never pursue her. She loves you, Cal, and I chose you. I chose this family. Caleb was quiet for a long time. I do not blame you for falling for her. She is extraordinary. She is, and she loves you, not me. Have you made your peace with that? I am making my peace with it. It is a process. All three brothers brought the letter to Clara that afternoon. They came to the boarding house together, hats in hand, filling Mrs. Crawford's parlor until the modest room looked like a dollhouse. Clara read the letter at the parlor table. When she reached the final paragraph, her hands trembled. My mother, your mother knew my mother. My mother kept a journal, Clara said. She wrote about a dear friend named Catherine Sullivan, who married a rancher and moved to the frontier. She said Catherine was the bravest woman she ever knew. Then Clara made her own confession. My father left me a small inheritance, $300. I was not desperate when I answered your advertisement. I had 3 proposals in Boston. Gerald Finch wanted a housekeeper. Mr. Pemberton wanted a nursemaid. Arthur Crane wanted a beautiful wife to display. None of them saw me as a person worth knowing. She looked at Caleb. I chose you because your letters made me believe you valued me for who I am. I had money. I had options. I chose you, Caleb. Freely. You had 3 proposals. You had money, and you chose to come here because my letters made you feel valued. Yes. And I repaid that trust by lying to you. Yes. Wyatt cleared his throat. For what it is worth, I think our mother would have loved you, Clara. Clara smiled. I think mine would have loved all 3 of you. Mrs. Crawford blew her nose into her apron and went to put the kettle on. The rebuilding happened the way good things happen on the frontier. Slowly, through steady work and the patient accumulation of trust day by day, like building a cabin one log at a time. Clara stayed at the boarding house. She maintained her independence, her sewing, her work at the schoolhouse. But she allowed Caleb back into her world, on her conditions. He courted her properly, as himself. No borrowed clothes, no empty bookshelves. He came to town in his own clothes, rode his own horse, and presented himself as exactly what he was. The first time Clara walked into the library of the main house, she stopped in the doorway. This is where the Marcus Aurelius belonged. Yes, and about 1,000 others. You must have been miserable in that cabin with empty shelves. I was miserable about a lot of things. The empty shelves were honestly the easiest part. She laughed, quiet and tentative, but real. The first real laugh she had given him since the world collapsed. With Wyatt, there was the evolution from attraction to friendship. He told Clara the truth about his feelings. Her response was clear. My heart chose Caleb from the first letter. It was always going to be Caleb. With Silas, there was intellectual companionship. He told Clara things Caleb would never share. How he sat up with sick calves. How he paid the school teacher's salary. how he kept their mother's flower garden alive for 2 years, watering roses that refused to grow in Wyoming clay. Together, Clara and Caleb built something new, a school for ranch workers' children. Clara's plan. Caleb supported it immediately, not because she asked, but because it was good. His willingness to follow her lead was proof that the man who once needed control was learning to share. Nearly a year had passed since Clara Whitfield stepped off the 3:15 train at Copper Ridge Station. It was autumn again, and Caleb brought her back to the cabin beside Willow Creek on an evening when the October sun, the same autumn sun that had been shining the day they first met, was painting the mountains in shades of amber and rose. The creek ran quiet and clear. The cabin looked exactly as it had the day she left it because Emmett Hargrove had tended her garden and fed her chickens and swept her porch every single week. The yellow curtains still hung in the windows. They caught the evening light and glowed. "I brought you here because this is where I fell in love with you," Caleb said. "Not the main house, not the ranch, here, in this cabin, watching you name chickens after authors and pull up carrots by mistake and read Tennyson to the sunset." He knelt. He had no ring. He would not use wealth to persuade. "Clara Whitfield, I am not a poor ranch hand. I am a wealthy man with more land and cattle than I know what to do with, and a house too big and too quiet for one person. I am also a man who lied to the woman he loved because he was too afraid to trust her. I am flawed. I am imperfect. And I am more frightened right now than I have ever been in my life, including the time a bull charged me in the north pasture." Clara laughed. Tears were running down her cheeks. "I cannot promise I will never make mistakes, but I can promise I will never lie to you again. I can promise honesty and partnership and respect and a love that grows stronger every day because it is built on truth. I can promise a library with every book you could ever want, and a school for the children you care about, and 3 brothers who will treat you as family, and a man who will spend the rest of his life trying to deserve you." Charlotte the chicken wandered over from the coop and observed the proceedings with her head tilted. "Will you marry me for real this time?" Clara pulled him to his feet. "Yes, but I have conditions. 3 of them. First, we keep this cabin. Our children will know this story, all of it, including the mistakes." "Done." "Second, the school is mine." "Done." "Third, if you ever lie to me again, I will leave, and I will take the chickens." "Absolutely done. Charlotte has never liked me." Charlotte clucked once sharply and returned to the yard. They stood together on the porch. The sunset flooded the valley with gold. The yellow curtains glowed. This was where she belonged. Right here. Home. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late October at the Church of the Good Shepherd, with every soul in the valley in attendance. The church was decorated with wildflowers, columbine and Indian paintbrush and wild daisies, the same flowers Caleb had given Clara the day they met. Clara wore a dress she had sewn from ivory silk. At her throat, her mother's cameo brooch. In her bouquet, dried lavender from her mother's garden in Boston, preserved in her father's Thoreau. The 3 brothers stood at the altar, Caleb in the center, terrified and incandescent. Wyatt as best man, his grin softened by real emotion. Silas to the left, his golden eyes warm with the satisfaction of a man who saw the ending first. They wrote their own vows: honesty, partnership, patience, laughter. When they kissed, the church erupted. Cowboys threw their hats. Mrs. Crawford wept. Emmett Hargrove blew his nose into an enormous handkerchief and made no effort to pretend he was not crying. As they walked down the aisle, Clara whispered, "No more secrets, no more tests, just us, facing whatever comes together." "Together," Caleb said. "That is the only word I need. Stronger together than apart, built with our own 2 hands." The seasons turned. Their first spring, Clara planted lavender beside the main house, grown from seeds carried from her mother's garden. The plants took hold in the Wyoming soil the way Clara herself had. Stubbornly, beautifully. On a morning in May, Clara stood in her lavender garden with her hand on her stomach and a secret in her smile. Their first child was a daughter. They named her Catherine. When Caleb held her for the first time, his big calloused hands trembling, Clara brushed the tears from his cheeks and said, "You see, this is what trust looks like." Silas was the first to hold his niece after her parents. The quietest man in Wyoming sang her a lullaby in a voice no one had ever heard him use before. The school opened that autumn. One room, one teacher. Within 2 years, it was two rooms with two teachers. Wyatt found his love unexpectedly. Hannah Price came from Ohio to teach at Clara's school. She was quiet, thoughtful, and possessed a dry wit that cut through Wyatt's charm like a blade through silk. When Wyatt proposed, Hannah's response became family legend. "I will marry you, Wyatt Hawthorne. But if you ever lie to me, I will make your brother's situation look like a pleasant Sunday afternoon." Silas married Ruth Calloway, daughter of a neighboring rancher. Their courtship was conducted largely through letters, despite living only 10 miles apart. The ranch prospered. Hawthorne Creek Ranch became the heart of a thriving community. Copper Ridge grew but kept its character. The town that had once kept a secret never forgot the lesson it taught. That love demands honesty. That trust once broken can be rebuilt but never taken for granted. Years passed, many years, and the story became legend. 25 years later, on a warm autumn evening, the Hawthorne family gathered for dinner at the main house. The long oak table was surrounded by three generations. Caleb at the head, his hair shot through with silver. Clara at the other end, cornflower blue eyes, still seeing everything. Young Catherine, now a woman grown, asked the question every Hawthorne child eventually asked. "Papa, if you could do it all again, would you still pretend to be poor?" Caleb looked across the table at Clara. 25 years, and the sight of her still made his heart skip. "No, I would have told your mother the truth from the very first moment. I would have stood on that station platform in my own clothes and trusted her to love me for who I am. Because that is what she deserved. That is what love deserves." Clara took his hand. "And that," she told her daughter, "is why I married him." Not the first answer. The second one. The one that took him a lifetime to learn. The cabin beside Willow Creek still stood, maintained and loved across the decades. The yellow curtains had been replaced several times, always with the same bright calico. The chicken coop housed descendants of the original six, and every hen was named after an author. On an evening in late September, with the aspens turning gold, Clara and Caleb sat together on the cabin porch in chairs worn smooth by decades. The creek murmured its ancient song. The mountains stood against a sky turning from blue to amber to violet. Caleb's hair was white now. Clara's was silver. But their hands clasped together on the armrest between their chairs held each other with the same strength they had always held. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Emmett had not said "boss" that day? Every day, and every day I am more grateful that he did. Why? Because if the truth had not come out, I would have kept lying. I would have kept controlling. And eventually it would have destroyed us. The truth breaking open was the best thing that ever happened to our marriage, because it forced us both to be brave. Clara smiled. "The bravest thing you ever did was not facing down Jedediah Thorne or riding through a flood, Caleb Hawthorne. No, no, the bravest thing you ever did was kneeling on this porch and asking me to marry you with nothing to hide behind." They sat together as the stars came out, filling the Wyoming sky with the same ancient light that had shone on this valley when Josiah first rode into it with nothing but a dream and a woman brave enough to share it. The creek whispered, the mountains stood, and the quiet of the frontier wrapped around them like a benediction. She still remembered stepping off that train into nothing. 25 years later, sitting on the porch he had built with his own hands, watching their grandchildren chase each other through the wildflowers, she thought that was the day my life began. Not the day she arrived, not the day she learned the truth, not even the day she said yes with Charlotte the chicken as her witness, but the day she stepped off a train into the unknown and chose freely and with open eyes to trust a stranger's words on paper. That was the beginning. Everything else was the story that followed. And what a story it was. If you enjoyed this tale of love and deception and second chances on the American frontier, go ahead and give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more stories from the Old West. And tell me in the comments below, do you think Caleb was justified in testing Clara the way he did? Or should he have been honest from the very beginning? What would you have done in her place when you discovered the truth? I would love to hear your thoughts. Drop your answer in the comments, and I will see you next week with another story. Until then, remember, a man keeps his word, and the bravest thing any of us can do is let ourselves be truly known.